Welcome. It's Monday, um, first first day of Easter week, of Holy Week. Easter week is following, and we're looking at Second Corinthians, and we're going to pick up where we left off. If you recall, we were in the middle of a section, a large section beginning in chapter 2, verse 14, and extending through chapter 7. And that section, broadly construed, is the section that deals with Paul's defense of his ministry. How does Paul defend himself against whom he assumes to be people trying to either twist his message or worse, have him being kicked out of influence? And they're basically telling people not to pay attention to Paul. Now, there are people like Dieter Georgi, and Hans Windisch, and there are others who build hypotheses around the notion of Paul's opponents. It's such an alluring prospect to do mirror reading of the texts and try to come up with possibilities as to whom Paul might have in view, although you could easily spend so much energy for what amounts to take your best shot, and really no one shot is better. But for what we want to do is just survey these chapters 4 through 7. Probably need a couple of videos to do it. And we begin with chapter 4. Now, 4, 1 through 15, the outline is basically seeing the light of the gospel, and then Paul describing the treasure that Paul says is held within clay jars. Paul sees this world very thinly, and that is, he sees this world and its connection to the spiritual world in very thin terms, and maybe they overlap in spots that we can't even identify. This is a gospel message where form matters and function matters. So a gospel message with no cross is no message of good news. Let's take a look at the text a little so I can show you where these ideas come from. So the first is Paul, and I would point out that these first 7 verses probably would be at home in the previous section, chapter 3. But for our purposes here, which is just to give you an introduction to Paul, to the second letter, it seems we're within okay to kind of point it like this. But Paul is picking up his defense after engaging in this 18-verse description of Exodus 34, Jeremiah 31, the new covenant plus the shining face of Moses, gives way to a therefore. Therefore, a really foolish thing to say, but really meaningful is when you see a therefore, ask why it's there, what it's there for. It connects, you see. It's God's mercy we're engaged in this ministry. In other words, God did not have to display God's glory in this way, but God in God's freedom has done so. He says we don't lose heart, and we keep pushing on. Notice the statements about sensory perception. We looked at this previously, that the idea that the veil hides and the glory is hidden and people were unable to see it. But now Paul talks about these things coming to pass and how people can see everything is in the sight of God, and those who can see, those who can't see the ministry, their world God has blinded, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing. So these words of sensory perception become important. Paul wants to encourage his audience to live within the light so that you can see, and let that light come out of the darkness so that that light provides knowledge of the glory of God. You want to try something out? Try navigating a room that's completely dark. I recommend shoes when you do so, for you will definitely throw your foot into something sharp. And but light gives you knowledge, and Paul makes that connection here. Now he compares that treasure, as we said, to a clay pot. Treasure, by the way, this word treasure is the word thesaurus. I love that because we use it to describe the synonym book, and its actual word in Greek is treasure chest. What the gospel is kept in clay pots. You can't find a more a clay pot was one of the most discardable things in the ancient world. Once it cracked, it was good for nothing. You could not recycle it. Glass you could heat up and reshape. Metal you could reuse. Even wood, if it was bad, you could burn. Clay pot was good for nothing. Its pieces were good for one thing, and that was you could scrape a message on the ostrakon. That's what those little pieces are called, ostraca. And so he says this enormous treasure is put into what amounts to a styrofoam container. This extraordinary message comes in very ordinary ways. And so Paul talks about, and look at how this message works. The gospel comes this way, and they're afflicted in every way. In every way, right? Crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, not forsaken, struck down, not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies. So Paul has this notion that when the gospel is presented, it has to be authentic, sincere. It cannot be a kind of message that is overworn with luxury or with possessions. This is a lesson the church has repeatedly gotten wrong, much to our shame. To the way that the message is conveyed, Paul thinks, really is important. In other words, maybe Paul's opponents are saying about him, oh, look at how he's afflicted so much. Everywhere he goes is turmoil. Is it possible that his adversaries are decrying his affliction, so that in decrying Paul's affliction, they say God's not blessing? Wow, if that is not as contemporary as you can get, I don't know what is. I've heard that a million times about somebody railing against a colleague or against another pastor. Paul says that if the affliction actually validates the ministry, so the form matters, and how the text moves in this way. How do we know this? We know that the one who raised the Lord Jesus will raise us also with Jesus. And so if we die with Christ, we will be raised with Christ. The message of Christianity is not something where you preserve everything. It's a message where you give everything up. And so perhaps Paul's opponents have misplaced this message just a little bit. And so this looks like a doxology, right? So that everything is for your sake, so that grace as it extends to more and more people may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God. A friend of mine, I had a conversation, it's a very anxious time, and we were getting ready to get off the phone, and he said to me, what's one thing you're really grateful for? What's one thing that's really positive that's happened to you this week? And so I thought that was a great way to end the conversation, to emphasize something positive that had transpired. So the next section, 4:16 through 5:10, is a more ambitious kind of section. Paul deals with this thin world. The world as we see it may not be an up and down model. Maybe there's a. Somebody asked me about a person who was a psychic, and they know that as a pastor, as a person who teaches Bible and whatnot. I say, oh, what do you think about a person that does that? I said, we believe in a whole spiritual world. So it doesn't seem to me like an outlandish thing to admit that someone may have access to that spiritual world in ways that, frankly, God said not to try. If you read the Old Testament, diviners and those kinds of folks are roundly, you're not to do that. But the fact that there's a spiritual existence, of course there's a spiritual existence. That's part of the reason why we do what we do. But for Paul, the connection between the two seems very thin, between the seen and the unseen. And Paul squarely comes down on the unseen. Home in the body, away with Jesus. The away is where Paul says when it comes down to it, that's where we're going to go. Even though for Paul, the combination of body, soul, and spirit all cohere. I really don't think Paul thinks of himself as a spirit in a body or as a mind in a body, but as a whole person. So, but I think that if you look at verse 5 of chapter 5, there's an indication that Paul understands this world not only in these thin terms, but as the Spirit is the thing that connects. So he talks about how he doesn't lose heart. He doesn't lose heart in the midst of affliction because he sees things as they really are, for he compares this slight momentary affliction. In other words, he relates this physical world and the affliction we encounter to momentary. He says it's preparing us for an eternal way to glory beyond all measure. We look at what can be seen. We don't look at what can be seen, but we look past it, through it, beyond it to what cannot be seen. For what can be seen is temporary. What cannot be seen is eternal. We have such a misunderstanding about these things, about that which we can see and that which cannot be seen. So when we have this porch, a sliding glass door, and I go to the back and to sit on the deck, and I close that sliding glass door, and we have a cat that just refuses to give up. He keeps pawing away at that door, thinking that that's the thing that he'll be able to finally, at some point, he'll be able to power through on that thing and find somehow, some way to get outside. And the glass keeps him from doing it. I tried to find a picture of the cat, the top cat, the kind with the left eye shut. That's the cat that sits at the door and paws at. Those are the two little critters. That's Orange Kitty because we're not that creative, and that's Rascal because he's a rascal. So those are our two cats. And as I said before, this cat thinks that glass door is absolutely real. That it shouldn't be there, that he can see right through it. He should be able to go right to the backyard. And unfortunately, he's an idiot. He's just a kitty. In any case, Paul says that the unseen is the more real. The unseen in this thinly designed kind of thing. He says this earthly tent is going to get destroyed. We have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. And so he says that we groan with this burden because we await for something more. A conviction, right, that so many people have, even in different faith groups. They talk about that which lies beyond. Look at what it says, though, in, let's see, right here. He has prepared for us this thing. God has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. So this guarantee, this is the tether that connects this world to the next. The Spirit, which is the down payment, that which Paul thinks is critical for our understanding and for our life, that this is the life-giving power of God, and this helps us to see how connected this world is to the other one, the one that's real. And so he says he has hope and confidence because, verse 7, we walk by faith, not by sight. The Hebrews chapter 11 gives you faith is the evidence of things. Sight is that which deceives us. And in the faith chapter of Hebrews 11, look what it says about faith. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And this is a really key. This text, Hebrews, is not written by Paul, but boy, that is a Pauline statement right there. Anyway, he moves on about that which is unseen, and it took us back to our chapter 3, so I got to move forward. And so then we have this, I want to make sure I get the right spot here. Okay. So we walk by faith, not by sight, and we have confidence. Paul says maybe to be away from the body at home with the Lord would be a better thing, but whether we're at home or away, we make our aim to please God, and that's the God put the two worlds together, and the eternal one and the spiritual, the eternal spiritual one and the physical material one. Genesis 3 had them ripped apart. Paul, by virtue of the cross of Christ, can see how they're being put back together again by the power of the Spirit. So we're going to come back and pick up with this in the next video. Make a comment. Tell me something that you learned new. Thanks.